Hello, everyone, and welcome to Pack Your Parachute, how to get and keep cyber insurance. My name is Nathan Austin. I'll be co-presenting today with our guest presenter, Jake from USI. I'm excited to have Jake join us. We don't often have guest presenters, but the topic at hand today, there's been a lot changing in 2021 relative to cyber liability insurance. And so we wanted to bring on an expert to talk through some of those things to hopefully help our clients and other community members plan for what's to come so you're not caught off guard from a budget perspective or to make sure that your parachute is in place if and when, hopefully, but hopefully not when you need it. And then Stephanie is behind the scenes producing. So a couple of Q&A items or house cleaning items. Please use the Q&A for questions. We typically will go through the content. We want to make sure that we respect everyone's time for about 30 minutes, and then we will open it up for Q&A at the end. But if you have any questions throughout the session, by all means, please go ahead and put them on the Q&A. That'll build a list for us to address afterwards. So thank you very much for attending, and I look forward to hearing your questions. As we move along, I always like to hit 1 minute about MyTech. I know the session isn't about MyTech, but we are a business and technology consulting organization that works with small and medium-sized businesses. We basically have learned over the last 21 years of being in business that we have a proven IT strategy that we help you implement. It is not the only IT strategy, but it is a proven one that we know delivers consistent, reliable results for our clients. Hopefully, we try and remove IT challenges for you, and by working together, our clients can achieve 4 times more value and productivity from their IT investments. And we have data to back it up. So if you'd like to have a conversation about that, we'd love to hear from you. Please raise your hand, let us know, and let's have a chat. But that's not why you're here today. So let's move on to the session. I'd like to introduce Jake. Jake, please tell us a little bit about yourself and dig into the presentation.
Yeah, appreciate it, Nathan, and thank you for the opportunity. Hello all, good afternoon. Thank you for spending the afternoon with us. So as Nathan said, I'm Jake Oman from USI. We are a global insurance brokerage, and we office out of Bloomington here in Minnesota, but have offices globally. And myself and my team, we are part of what we call our manageability group, which specializes in a very finite group of areas of risk and related insurance coverages, including D&O, employment practices liability, and the least of which is cyber liability. So our group and this area within insurance has been catapulted to the forefront in terms of areas of risk, threat vectors, and what businesses think about when they think about what can cause material disruptions to their operations and to their business. And so we've been spending a disproportionate amount of our time focusing on these risks and helping our clients navigate not only the threat vectors and helping improve their overall posture, but as importantly, navigating the insurance industry. And I'll get into that a little bit in terms of what underwriters are looking for and how to set about effective strategies to get the best possible results. So you see the agenda here today. So I'll talk a little bit about the threat environment, what we're seeing, and I'll actually talk about a few recent cyber events that I've been involved with here with local Minnesota companies, and I'll kind of start very high level and then kind of get more granular and more micro as we go along here and talk about specific trends that we're seeing. And then thankfully we'll talk about some corresponding solutions. And when Nathan's group and MyTech, certainly they are an important part of those solutions. And again, maturing your organization in terms of a posture perspective. And then also talk about what's going on in the insurance industry, which is again changing quite a bit, has changed quite a bit in the last even 6 to 8 months. And so hopefully by the end of this, you'll I guess have more awareness of what to expect if you haven't had one of a very inevitably tough renewal with regards to cyber insurance, but prepare yourself for how to again navigate those difficult areas right now. So let's go next slide. So yeah, this is a classic quote. There's been several Fed chairs that have kind of quoted cyber attacks, but I think it kind of hits home with regards to where cyber has landed in terms of prioritization of risks. And you can see Jerome Powell said that cyber attacks are the #1 threat to the global financial system. And if you think about the proliferation of technology in our world, certainly COVID has and remote working has brought that even more to the forefront. But even prior to COVID, technology was becoming a much more critical component in all areas of business. Doesn't matter if you're in healthcare, manufacturing, public entity, technology. It has really immersed as a critical part of most business models. And so as that has provided efficiencies and conveniences with business, it also has provided risks. And I think I mentioned before, we're going to talk about some real life Minnesota companies that have anonymized, of course, but we'll talk about their experiences with cyber. But I think one of the misnomers that we hear from our clients is, this is not a me issue, right? It's a big company issue. We're not going to be a target. And certainly I think a lot of companies have opened their eyes up to this misnomer in the past 6 to 12 months when they've heard about, either experienced themselves or heard about their peers suffering cyber incidents, which have become, again, much more mainstay than they were even 2-3 years ago. But here's a little statistics that kind of reinforce that trend. This is from Chubb Group, which is one of the largest cyber insurance companies in the world. This is taken actually from their book of business, their claims experience, and it's comparing 2017 to end of 2020. And in short, what you're seeing here is it's breaking down revenue thresholds on their client base and the proportion of annual claims that fall within those revenue ranges. And so you can see in 2017, roughly 40% of the claims on their cyber book of business were with organizations that were over $500 million in revenue. Right, that kind of fit that perception that this is a big company issue. Well, now fast forward to end of 2020, now roughly 30%, the biggest percentage, were organizations under 25 million in revenue. And we'll get into a little bit more about the reason behind this and what the bad actors are really focusing on today, because it continues to change. But I guess point being here that again, it's not a big company thing. It's not a big company risk, and it's agnostic also of industry and segment that you're in. And we'll kind of talk about how the impetus and the imminency for how these breaches happen, and hopefully you'll have a better understanding of why bad actors really don't discriminate. Really, they're motivated by a few different things. Obviously, financial gain being a big one. And so again, they're agnostic to size and industry as of today. So some recent trends and breaches, and I'll talk about some big ones that most of us are familiar with, but also some notable ones that are causing this cascading effect. So most of us here in Minnesota are near dear target experienced their large breach back in 2013. Anthem, the Blue Cross Blue Shields of the world, they had a huge breach back in 2015, which compromised tens of millions of health records. And then Equifax, right, a credit company, suffered a large scale breach as well, which again impacted probably most of us on this call here in one way, shape, or form. And so when we read about those, again, we're thinking as an organization, as a small, medium-sized business, right? We don't fall anywhere near the realm of where these companies are by way of revenue, by way of publicity, awareness of risk, as well as just revenues and record count. Now, again, fast forward to this past year, we still see these mega breaches like Colonial Pipeline, CNA Insurance Company, which again, one of the largest, ironically, one of the largest writers of cyber insurance in the world, and then SolarWinds and Microsoft Exchange. Why these are important? You think about Colonial Pipeline, right? When you talk about Equifax, for example, right? The impetus for that breach was really targeting those protected, confidential data records. Colonial Pipeline, not the same situation. Now, it ended up being a ransomware situation where they paid millions of dollars in ransom. Thankfully, they got most of it back at this point. But what's significant about that breach is the operational interruption, right? Colonial Pipeline, which supports most of the East Coast in terms of their pipeline. The cascading effect on the supply chain that was caused by this cyber event was something that was relatively new. Certainly it's happened before that, but from this size and scope perspective, it was something that really opened up a lot of people's eyes. And so when we think about operational risks, right, we don't just think about, okay, what kind of protected data do we have? What is our regulatory risk by way of that protected data or records that we hold? It also is, if you think about automation and networked equipment, it's operational risk, right? So if your organization suffers a network interruption, could be 1 hour, could be 1 day, and even though you may not have a lot of protected information, more than likely your organization is much more networked from a business model perspective than it was in the past, and certainly that's the trend that continues to increase over time. And so that operational risk is something that we're paying close attention to. CNA, I put that one in there just because of the size and scope of that one. It was north of a $40 million ransom, but I think what's important there is, again, an organization like CNA, obviously well entrenched in the cyber world, and still was able to suffer a large-scale ransomware event. And so even large, sophisticated organizations still have these vulnerabilities where these bad actors are able to penetrate their system and cause significant operational and financial damages. Now, the last two, why those are important. So this is where kind of part of the explanation as to why these bad actors are able to scale down to small and medium-sized businesses. So SolarWinds and Microsoft Exchange, these two were in the past 12 months, both were targeting these service providers, technology service providers. And this has been a recent trend with threat vectors in targeting the supply chain, these technology vendors, which have tens of thousands of customers all over the world, ranging from small startup businesses to large Fortune 500. But again, once they tap into like a SolarWinds platform or a Microsoft Exchange vulnerability, they're able to cascade and cast a very, very wide net in a very, very short period of time to all of their customers and clients. So the Exchange vulnerability, for example, if you had the specific on-premises like Exchange server, right, you had a vulnerability, and it was unknown for a period of time where these bad actors were able to expose that vulnerability. Now, eventually, obviously, they released a patch, and you were able to remediate that exposure. But that caused a significant amount of corresponding breaches and compromised networks. We had clients that did suffer related breaches stemming from both SolarWinds and Microsoft Exchange vulnerabilities. So I think that the supply chain risk, whether it's supply chain from an operational perspective when you look at Colonial Pipeline, but also the supply chain risk as you outsource more of your technology services, right? That presents another risk in and of itself too. But now, I don't want to give the impression that outsourcing any component to your IT is a bad thing, right? Most of the time, it is a logical and a risk mitigation strategy, as opposed to small medium-sized businesses relying on their own in-house IT groups to support their IT and technology needs. However, I just mentioned that because it is a new risk and that needs to be acknowledged and addressed. So I mentioned some local breaches. So these are 3 clients of ours here in Minnesota that suffered pretty large scale and significant ransomware attacks in the last year. The first is pretty recent. This was a few months ago. A real estate firm suffered a ransomware attack. I believe it was caused by an employee clicking on a malware infected email. Excuse me. They had effective backups, so they were exclusively cloud-based. They had no on-premises servers or storage, all cloud-based. Had real-time backups, so I think they lost maybe 2 hours of total data. So operationally, not a huge deal, right? They could still operate, they could still serve their clients and customers. However, they had data that was exfiltrated. So these bad actors took data off their system, and it happened to be data of high net worth investors of this particular firm, and they threatened to expose that information on the dark web unless they paid a ransom. So they ended up paying a $200,000 ransom, total all-in expenses right around $600,000 when you talk about legal and forensics as well. So again, a very well protected organization. However, these bad actors are starting to wake up to the fact that organizations are becoming more mature, getting better backups, and so now they're pivoting their model slightly in these situations to take the data out so they can still perpetuate their business model and I guess necessitate the need for organizations to pay ransoms. Similar situation with the next one. It's a manufacturer, about 40 million in revenue. Again, good, solid, effective backups. So data operationally, not a huge impact, although a lot of soft costs and stress and those sort of intangible impacts. But here again, data was exfiltrated, which included PHI, protected data. And so they did end up paying a ransom, occurred a little north of $300,000 in total expenses. And they are suffering some regulatory impact and investigations right now due to that exfiltration of data, which is still ongoing. So those expenses likely will exceed $500,000 all in with attorney fees. But there again, right, the sophistication of these attacks continues to increase. The last one was by far the largest here. And this was both operational, mostly operational. So their backups were impaired, they were impacted, but you can see the difference here in the impact. So they were down for four to 5 days. And because of the impact of their backups being impaired, they did end up paying a $1.2 million ransom. Total expenses were close to $2 million. Most of which I should say was paid by insurance. But here again, I would say had they had effective quality backups and the impact was mitigated from operational perspective, that ransom would have been far less, right? They didn't have a lot of exposed data, so it was really an operational and a business need to pay, as opposed to really that data exfiltration factor. So again, piggybacking on that ransomware trend, so we are seeing, continue to see larger demands, especially when you have exfiltrated data, and the bad actors continue to become much more sophisticated, whereby there are several key bad actor groups. However, the number of bad actors continues to grow as this business model continues to be extremely profitable. So we talked about the double extortion, where historically it was just encrypting your data, impacting your operating systems, and then getting a ransom. Now we're talking about that extortion and exfiltration of data and threat to expose data to the public. So it's becoming more difficult to extract the malware from affected systems. Again, as the bad actors have become more sophisticated, it's more difficult to remediate these situations. Average downtime, 21 days. That's a floating number. I've seen anywhere from 3 days all the way up to north of 30. So I think it's all dependent on, again, your network infrastructure and how protected you are. And then industries targeted. This is something that does change over time. So historically, healthcare has been one of the biggest targets for these bad actors. But we're seeing a growing increase with targeted professional services, government agencies, obviously, and believe it or not, manufacturing. So we're seeing that operational risk causing bad actors to target organizations and sectors where they feel controls are less mature, and manufacturing is one of those. And so we are seeing a growing frequency in ransomware events in that space. All right, just some additional trends that we're seeing as well. I kind of already touched on COVID. So you think about the transition to hybrid work environments or remote working environments where your IT group and your controls are just harder to manage when you've got network equipment now spread out and canvassed over a much bigger geographic area. And it's just much more difficult to maintain your consistent controls when you have that hybrid environment. So it's caused organizations to pivot from an operational perspective, but now we're playing catch up in terms of making sure that the security has followed along with that. We are seeing increasing law enforcement. So we are seeing some high profile cases, obviously, with Uber being mentioned there, being indicted for these large scale breaches. But I don't think that is something that's going to go away. I think the federal government is imposing more awareness and more initiatives to clamper down on these cyber events. And so I think we're going to see more of that coming. You can see some large settlements here, mainly with healthcare organizations with the OCR. But again, the SEC with publicly traded companies it has continued to increase their vigilance in the cybersecurity space as well. And we are still seeing some political motivation. So Zoom, you maybe heard some Zoom hacks where bad actors are listening in on Zoom calls or actually WebEx calls right now and trying to steal corporate confidential information and intellectual property. But also they're politically motivated, especially if around election time. Obviously, with Russia, it was a big issue. So that continues to be a motivation. Although I would say we spend most of our time with financially motivated bad actors, but the political motivation or motivated bad actors still do exist for sure. So now to no insurance. So you think about cybersecurity, you kind of think about three different core areas historically. You've got people, being you and I, and how we manage our interaction with our organizational networks. You've got processes, right? So think incident response, think employee training, and then you've got technology, right? You've got antivirus, firewalls, endpoint detection and response. Insurance has kind of become a quasi fourth leg to that stool, meaning it kind of touches all three of those areas, but it's come to the forefront more so in the last year, just given the rise and proliferation of these cyber events. And so historically, it's been very much a buyer's market, whereby the supply of carriers willing to write the coverage has far exceeded the demand, meaning the number of buyers that are willing to purchase cyber. That is completely inversed in the last 12 months. So now we're seeing an overabundance of demand for the coverage in relation to the number of carriers that are willing to supply that coverage or limit, and thereby, law of economics, we're seeing rising rates. Some as high as 300%. I've seen upwards of 500% on some renewals, on tougher renewals with less than mature controls, and that's just a function of the risk, pricing the risk accordingly. So we're seeing rising retentions or deductibles. Again, usually those are on renewals, those are doubling, if not tripling or quadrupling. We're introducing co-insurance, we meaning the insurance companies, not the brokers, but whereby they're asking insureds to share in that risk more so, right? It could be 10%, could be 20%. And again, those are usually on tougher risks, larger risks, but we are seeing it more frequently. We're seeing carriers consistently cutting capacity, cutting limits. Again, trying to keep that balance of risk to premium in check. And then I think more importantly, we're seeing more vigorous underwriting. So we'll talk about this, I think, in the next couple slides, but we're seeing, and if you ever already experienced a cyber insurance renewal in the last 6 to 12 months, you will definitely notice the difference. So they're imposing far greater restrictions on underwriting, whereas some insurance companies will not write a particular organization if they don't have multi-factor authentication in place, period. We just had another major insurance company announce this 2 weeks ago, Beasley, that will not write business organizations that do not have MFA in place. They're looking for diligent backups, employee training. They're requiring specific software more frequently, mostly related to EDR tools and XDR tools. They are performing their own scans and assessments. So unbeknownst to you, when you get underwritten by Travelers or Chubb or Beasley, they are performing non-invasive scans of your network. So they're looking for your IP addresses, your open ports, and whether or not you receive the report, that is part of the underwriting process now. And so and a lot of times they will not write business. They will not provide terms if you have too many known vulnerabilities. And they'll also ask for, event-specific questions, right? So, do you have, vulnerabilities to SolarWinds? Do you have Microsoft Exchange? So again, it's a maturation of the underwriting process, which I would argue is a good thing. But the reaction of where we were 12 to 18 months ago to where we are today, the pendulum swung completely opposite direction. I think it would have been a slower maturation process, but not for the spate of incidents that we're seeing right now. So I know we're running up on time here, so I'm going to try and breeze through it here so we can make sure to address Q&A at the end. So we talk about the maturation of underwriting in the cyberspace. These are the biggest critical areas that underwriters are focused on today. This is quickly becoming kind of the first phase of 2, which is one of the next 5, and I'll briefly touch on that. But these are the biggest 5 areas that are focus areas for underwriters. One is multi-factor authentication, which I already talked about. So you think about how how bad actors get into the system, right? It's phishing, it's masking, but they're also doing password sprays. So you think about how many breaches that we've all been impacted by, whether it's Yahoo or Google, Amazon, right? All these large organizations have had cyber incidents in one way, shape, or form. So there's a lot of passwords that have been compromised, and so when they password spray for a particular profile across various networks and various accounts, right? That one factor, that one username password becomes a very, very weak protection. So multi-factor, meaning you're getting a text, a phone call, you get thumbprints, again, multiple forms to authenticate the validity of the person that's trying to access those networks is very critical. And I would argue, although if you don't have it in place and you're running up against renewal and you've got 2 weeks to implement it, very, very inconvenient. However, I would say the reason why underwriters are focused on that so much is because when they analyze the impetus and the cause for these claims, MFA would have protected a large portion of these incidents. So I can't stress enough the importance of implementing MFA. Second is endpoint detection and response, EDR, and also extended detection and response, which is just a broader form, more realistic form of EDR. So again, when there's vulnerabilities on a network and there's bad actors on your network, the time in which you're able to discover those bad actors on your network is very critical, right? It limits the amount of data they're able to access, and it's able to limit the damage and the interruption they're able to cause on your system. And so EDR technology is close behind multi-factor in terms of the push or requirement for underwriters right now. I would say even into 2022, I would expect most carriers will require EDR. Number three is 24/7 SOC, so SOC monitoring. Again, that consistent monitoring, whether it's done internally or outsourced to a third party, monitoring of all logs and reports. Again, that real-time monitoring allows you to react much quicker and mitigate the inevitability, which is a cyber incident. Backups are huge, right? We've already talked about backups, but now carriers are focusing more on, okay, you've got backups, they're in the cloud, that's great. Are they immutable? Are they segregated or air-gapped from your network? Because in that, if you remember that one ransomware I talked about, that $1.2 million ransom, they did have cloud-based backup. They had real-time backup. They were great. They weren't air-gapped. So bad actors got into their network. There was no separation between their network environment and the backups. Backups were impaired. So again, that air gap, that immutable status, their immutable profile is critical to make sure that you're mitigating the impact when those bad actors do inevitably get into your system. And then lastly here is network segmentation. So from an operational perspective, you're a manufacturer, right? That automated equipment are those networks and those systems segregated from others, right? And so if they're able to impair or I guess infiltrate part of your network, segmenting those critical components from others will allow you to, again, wall off and compartmentalize that risk. There's a big focus right now for end-of-life and end-of-support software. If you have it, right, it's not necessarily an issue if it's not segregated, right? You may have a business need for having end-of-life, end-of-support software, right? It's an old system, old environment. However, carriers want to see that it's segregated, meaning that vulnerability, that exposed system can't impact another, and they can't move laterally between the two. And again, that's what I just mentioned, process for monitoring and preventing lateral movement. So again, we're just trying to compartmentalize the impact that bad actors can have once they're in your network. Then lastly, this is kind of stemming back to that Microsoft Exchange and SolarWinds breaches, patching cadence of cadence catching. Or patching cadence. Let me get that right. So again, there's going to be vulnerabilities within software. It always is going to happen. Now, what they want to see is a dedicated and systemic process for how quickly those are implemented, those patches are implemented, because if you sit on it for 14, 30 days, right, again, it just amplifies the risk that is posed by these software vulnerabilities. That again, it's a common thing. Software is meant to be continuously updated, But again, having a system in place to make sure that those processes are implemented consistently is critical. So real quick, what can you do? I would say I talked about pretty much everything on this page already. The one thing I will stress here is starting your process early, right? So all those wonderful controls in software, whether it's software or procedural improvements, those are all great. I would say from an underwriting perspective, from an underwriting process perspective, start early. Because if for example, you're starting your renewal process 30 days out, they run their scans, they find out you don't have an MFA or RDP or EDR, you're going to be in a very precarious situation, because normally you could extend out 30 days to give you more time to implement whatever requirements they're imposing. That's not the case anymore. So we have a lot of clients that are scrambling to implement things that they could have done 30, 60, 90 days ago. So if you get out ahead, build out a longer, elongated roadmap, it's going to make your life much, much easier. And I would say too, talk to your underwriters, right? Have your broker schedule calls, because there's a lot of compensating controls that you may implement or may have in place that maybe not replace something they're asking you to do, but it certainly allows you to tell the story better. Because you may have an application that's 2-3 pages long, but there's only so much you can glean from a cyber renewal application with yes/no questions. And so I'd always encourage people to have more connectivity with their underwriters, especially if the story you're telling is a positive one, right? You may have a critical roadmap being deployed in the next 30, 60, 90 days. If you're implementing MFA in the next 30 days and your renewal is in that time frame, again, that's critical information for them to know. That's not going to be encapsulated or captured on an application. So make sure that you keep the lines open. And I would also encourage your internal IT professionals or outsourced IT professionals to be a critical component in this underwriting process. And that includes engagement with your broker or agent, as well as underwriters, if it makes sense. Because again, we're going to continue to see enhanced scrutiny in underwriting. And I think, the altruistic part of me says it's coming from a good place, right? They don't want you to suffer a breach. They don't want you to suffer a claim. They don't want you to incur breach-related expenses. And so your interests are definitely aligned here. Now, how to manage that process and navigate it so you're not completely disrupting your business, right? That's where that planning and road mapping really helps. I think with our time, I'll just I guess suffice it to say on this slide, preparation, right? So whether you're utilizing outsourced firms, like Nathan's, like MyTech, or a pre-breach resource from your carrier, having these conversations proactively in terms of like coordinating the various critical parties in a breach scenario. Much better to do ahead of a breach than actually when you're in the trenches and you're figuring out, what to do, who to call, who to engage. I guess that's the summation of this slide. But again, that open communication, that proactive communication, there are a lot of statistics that say that will mitigate a significant portion of your ultimate breach expenses in the end by having good preparation. And it's not just a technology thing, right? It's a process, it's a procedure thing as well.
Yeah. Thanks, Jake, for going through all of that. I think it's I have a ton of questions actually, just myself, let alone hopefully from the audience. But we try and keep it to, we're a little bit over, but that's okay. I want to respect everyone's time. We're going to open it up for Q&A, but I definitely always like to mention, hey, we try and put valuable business content that's applicable and relevant and pertinent to our small and medium business clients. So if you want to keep in touch with that thing, here are some action items that you can take. Please, like us or follow us on LinkedIn or Facebook. If there's anyone in your organization or colleagues or peers that can benefit from some of this information, please share it. Because we have seen this impact our clients as far as they didn't have these pieces in place. Even though this is things that we've all been talking about, I think, for years between us and our clients. insurance. But as Jake mentioned, a lot has changed in the last 6 to 8 months in the cyber insurance world, and so it's catching people off guard. And so this is one of the reasons why we did this session, to try and help create awareness around this, so that you're not caught off guard either the end of this year or going into 2022. Join us for future events, mytech.com/events. And if you're thinking about, we do a lot of Microsoft 365 education and training. We also have Power User Group sessions that we'd love to see those folks for in the future. But with that said, I want to thank everyone for attending who's able to attend. Like I said, we're going to open it up for questions, but if you need to drop off, thank you so much for joining us today. Hopefully you found some valuable information. I know I did from Jake. But for those who can stick around, let's open it up for questions. Stephanie?
Thanks. There are no questions in the queue right now, so if you want to get started with a couple of yours, Nate, give everybody time to put them in there.
Yeah, no, that'd be great. So perfect. So I actually had some questions. I appreciate you mentioning the EDR, MDR, XDR technology. That's something that that's an evolving in the last couple of years, security space technology tool that I think people are starting to understand. But when you talked about 24/7 monitoring, can you clarify that a little bit? Is that one of the things I've heard from a couple of the these questionnaires that our clients have asked us to fill out with them or on behalf of them. We've seen that SIM, or the Security Incident Event Management software tools, being one of those things that we're foreshadowing that might be a requirement going into 2022, or at least towards the end of 2022. How related is that to when you said 24/7 monitoring? Is that the same thing, or is there a different layer that you've seen the underwriters look for in the underwriting process?
Yeah, they definitely are correlated, Nathan, and we haven't seen, those are kind of prioritized on that list in terms of where we're seeing underwriters drawing very firm lines between, if you do this, it's a go, no go, right? MFA, I would say, is the top of that list, and EDR is probably close behind that. But the SOC and 24/7 monitoring, to your point, I think foreshadowing that into 2022 is probably a fair statement. And again, there are various, like you mentioned, there's various forms that could take. But I think at the crux of it, what they want to know is, right, when bad actors hit on a Saturday night at 11 p.m., you have an ability to react to become aware that there's irregular activity in your network, and to be able to react to it. I think that's at its core, that's what they're trying to get at, because what they obviously don't want to have happen is, that to go unchecked for 1 day, 2 day, 4 days, and you well know what can happen in a matter of hours versus days, in terms of the impact on the network.
Yeah, the analogy that we like to use when we work with our clients on that front is, if your sump pump had the ability to alert you that your basement was flooding, you want to be able to take action on that immediately, right? Not wait till finding out that your basement's flooded before you actually do anything about it. You can really mitigate the damage that can be done if you're able to catch that, sooner. Anyway, that's an analogy that seems to resonate with our clients.
Well, I think it's interesting though, because it works whether you're talking about an operational risk, right? So think of a networked equipment or networked automated manufacturing process, or when you're talking about the amount of I guess movement on the network that these bad actors can do, right? So whether you're talking about a healthcare institution that can have 1,000 records exposed versus 10 million, or a manufacturer, right, that's interrupted in the middle of their process, right? It doesn't matter what kind of risk you're talking about. The time is the extra time, I guess, is an exponential increase in the amount of inevitable damage.
Yeah, and one of the other data points that I've seen referenced in this type of conversation is that the average time a bad actor is inside your environment is north of 180 days. And so part of what you're talking about in some of these technologies, especially the MDR, XDR, EDR tools and the monitoring and alerting, is can you shrink that from literally months down to hours, minutes or hours, right? And that's really what Jake's talking about, and that's what those tools help do. And we've actually seen that happen where none of our, I don't even want to say this, but clients that have subscribed, that we have a lot of these tools in place where we've done a lot of these network segmentation, have these tools in place. They have had incidences where people have clicked on something, as you had mentioned earlier, Jake, that it's because somebody clicks on something typically that downloads the malware that starts off this process, but those tools catch it before it actually causes damage. We can actually stop the damage even on the local machine before it even goes laterally anything else. So those tools do really work, and it's very powerful. So I understand why underwriting has seen, they're looking at the data and they're seeing that that's having an impact. So I have two other kind of questions.
We did have a couple of questions.
Oh, please. Yeah, that'd be great. Awesome.
So the first one, Jake, is when you mentioned the non-intrusive scans on an applicant's network during underwriting, who's doing that and how? Is that a polite hacker situation?
Yeah, no, they're definitely not. It's definitely not a penetration test, meaning they're not trying to penetrate your network. That's why I said non-invasive. So there's maybe a handful, maybe 2 to 4 insurance companies that in-house have either purchased or developed their own internal scanning technology, or cybersecurity analysts that will basically scan. Think of this like a wide scan of internet-facing IP addresses and ports, and basically your endpoint to public to the internet. So they will scan, right, all these related IP addresses and look for known vulnerabilities or look for ways in which bad actors can access your network through these known vulnerabilities. So they'll come back with reports, and the reports usually, again, those outside of those few exceptions, usually they're engaging with a third party. Like BitSight would be a common third party scanning partner that these carriers contract with to perform these scans on either insureds that they currently write, or new applicants that are applying for coverage. And so when they get these reports back, and these reports, now I will say there's some inconsistency with the weighting on them, because you may get a report from one carrier that says you're 100 being the best, right? You may get a 90 from one report, and you may get a 60 from another report. So there is some inconsistency, but I would say the reports are getting better, they're maturing, and I would say there's useful data regardless of the report you're seeing, because we've had numerous clients get these reports back and see an unknown vulnerability that was on these reports, and they were able to remediate it. And there was also another example where we had a insured get a report back that said, basically, you are already under attack. There's already bad actors in your system based on the network activity they're seeing. Again, externally facing towards publicly facing ports and IPs. But they were able to uncover an unknown breach in the middle of an underwriting process. No different than biometric. Think of biometric screening, right, for health insurance, right? Taking your blood, although that's a little more invasive than these scans are. But know that they're not creating any vulnerabilities. They're not again not trying to penetrate your network. They do not penetrate your network. But it's more of a snapshot in time on what your internet-facing potential vulnerabilities are. And that's why I said, starting the process early, because there's sometimes there are inaccuracies with this report, so they may attribute or associate an inaccurate IP address to your organization. You may have a company that has a similar name, and they're associating this vulnerability with this IP address that has nothing to do with your business, right? Those should be fleshed out, and the more time you have to do that, the better results you're going to see. I think there is value in those reports. I really do, and I think they're going to become. I think as they mature and become more accurate, they're going to become a more important part of the underwriting process.
Awesome, thank you. Next question that came in is there going to be a push for MFA for admins or full company at the domain login level, or just O365 or remote access? So lots of questions packed in there.
Good question. So right now, the few carriers that are requiring it, meaning they're requiring it for renewals, their current insureds, and they're requiring it for applicants for coverage. They are requiring it for all the above. So the ones that are taking hardline stances are looking for that to be deployed across the entire network for all, again, all domain access, admin, remote access, all the above. There are some that, again, probably a little behind them in terms of their conservative position on it, where they may just look for remote access or admins. But I would say if you're deliberating on the deployment of MFA between one of those three categories, I would default to just doing all three, not just because of the underwriting implications, but because I firmly believe that it's a good it's a cost-effective way to mitigate risk, right? That cost benefit makes sense.
Thanks for that. Last question in the queue right now is, how much good does it do to show evidence of due diligence or due care in trying to implement security practices, even if the overall picture isn't meeting the standards set here? It looks bad. Does it matter whether or what work has been done?
I think part of that might be related to a lot of the clients we work with, either for regulatory purposes or if they're trying to be proactive, will do a more deeper security assessment that covers physical, administrative, and technical controls, and they basically build a security roadmap. And so I think this question is somewhat related to that, because we've heard that it puts organizations in a better position, even though they might have things that they're yet to mitigate, right? So there could be things that the underwriters might say, oh, well, you got to have this done or whatever. So like, what's your take on that? What have you seen relative to that helping folks or not?
Yeah, I would say for sure it's a helpful helpful data point in the underwriting process. There are some caveats to that. I would say the caveat is, if you're talking about road mapping MFA or even arguably EDR, some carriers will want to see that implemented within, let's just say 30 days of the time the coverage is effective. Right, and they will ask for an attestation that you're going to implement it within X time period. So there's no question that doing an assessment, doing a thorough assessment, showcases the fact that you prioritize information cybersecurity. But Nathan, your point, that roadmap and more importantly the timeline of the critical components of that roadmap are the caveat to that comment. Meaning, again, if one of those critical 5 areas are on our roadmap, and let's just say MFA is 12 months out versus 4 months out, that's going to be fleshed out in the underwriting process regardless. So I would say I'll always err on the side of transparency, because, and that goes back to my telling a story to the underwriters. You're better at being transparent, because again, the increase in sophistication of the underwriting process is going to flesh out these critical components regardless. Yeah. And so at least if you can tell your story, you can get out in front of the messaging and communication of it.
Great. So awesome. And there's Stephanie, I don't know, I didn't see another question, but I do have a couple others that I think I'd like to ask based on what I've seen and heard that I'd love to get Jake's opinion on if there's nothing else that's come through.
Yeah, I don't see any other ones coming through right now.
Great. So there's two things. One, I think that you talked about some low-hanging fruit, and I think that one of the things that's on that top 5 list is segmenting your network. It's one of the things that, for the most part, is a low-cost mitigation method. You probably already have the technology in place. So it's the physical stuff is already there. It's a matter of how you configure the physical stuff. So I don't know if you can speak to that a little bit, because I think that's a very much overlooked area of protecting yourself from attacks like this.
Yeah, so this goes back to that data exfiltration risk, and this is, well, it's stemming from both that as well as the Exchange and SolarWinds breaches and those attacks, and focus on IT service providers. But to your point, right? It is far less costly than let's say purchasing a high-end EDR tool. And now, is the impact the same? Arguable, right? But I think where the industry is going is, it's becoming more of a question of do you know what data you have on your network, number one, and do you know where it is, number two, right? And can you properly safeguard the most critical components of your network? Because back to that lateral movement piece, if you have if you have let's just say your corporate confidential information, right, your crown jewels of your organization, and they're in a shared drive that has access with multiple different divisions or departments of your organization, that's an easy fix, right? And so making sure that those critical, what is your critical data, where is it stored, and who has access to it? Because I think one of the questions that we're seeing more and more is, can you rationalize and monitor the business case use for who has access to those most critical components of your network and your most critical critical data on your network? But that end of life, end of support, patch cadence, all of that is kind of overarching theme within that network segmentation. And if you think about the proliferation of technology within various business models, right? As our endpoints, as our devices, as our network infrastructure, it just becomes more sophisticated. I think segmentation, to your point, is going to be a far more critical portion of even when you look at these top 5 here. I think network segmentation is going to quickly rise up that list as our network infrastructure just becomes more and more complex.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks. And like one of the examples that I know, we received a call from someone earlier this year that was an organization that had just gotten hit with ransomware, and these bad actors know that you have backups, but if you haven't segmented your backups, then guess what? Now your backups are encrypted too, right? So that's just a simple example of like just doing that segmentation, and that's what happened to them, is that because they hadn't segmented their backups got encrypted at the same time as everything else did. So they had backups, but they didn't protect them properly through segmentation and keeping them kind of a gapped from the rest of the network. And so they were in a position like one of the other clients you mentioned where they didn't have effective backups because they didn't do that segmentation. So I want to hit on the incident response plan. The last question I have is, it was one of the bullets on the last slide there, and you talked about how ultimately what I understand is that when you're in, if you're in the middle of an incident, right, something's happening, some chaos ensues. Yep. And you don't want to be trying to figure out your plan while you have that happening, right? So you want to be able to pull out a plan that says, here's what you're doing. Can you talk about, like, you've probably seen both sides of that equation, like organizations that have had a plan and been able to execute when that happens, and organizations who haven't. Can you speak to that, and just to kind of reinforce the value of potentially, trying to create at least a basic incident response plan?
Yeah, so this has changed quite a bit in the last few years, right? I think a lot of organizations that had incident response plans in place, let's just dating back 3, 4, 5 years, it was they'd go through a process, they'd delineate, who the parties at the table were, they'd memorialize in a document, and then stick it on the shelf and collect dust, right? So I think a lot of organizations have come a long way, and the process has matured since then. But I would say, this is a question that all underwriters, all insurance companies will ask about. However, it's not a go no go type situation, and the reason why is the insurance industry has created models to arguably coddle in a certain way. They say hold hands, but I think it's because it's allowed organizations to take a step back from where I think they should be in terms of developing and testing and embedding that into their organizational kind of business continuity strategy. So I mean, a good plan obviously will be manuscript of the organization, because every organization is different. You're right, or positional hierarchy, individuals, and so you want to make sure it's catered to your organization on who the actual parties that need to be at that table are. But I think more importantly, figuring out who the critical third parties are, you need to notify, and when. We just went through a situation or an exercise with a client this week where they do buy cyber insurance, and so they did their own assessment unrelated to insurance. Right? They hired a third party firm to do assessment. They do that tabletop, and one of the outgrowths of that tabletop was formally embedding insurance and the insurance process into that incident response plan. Now, I'm not saying insurance needs to be, I guess the center point of that. However, I would argue for most situations, most organizations, the breach response model and process embedded in your insurance program probably should be the first or second call you make. And why I say, the insurance industry is somewhat coddled is some organizations, once they buy insurance, they get their 24/7, 365 hotline, good to go, right? This is the number I call, and they're going to hold my hand throughout the rest of the process, which is partly true. However, I would also say when you're in those high stress, chaotic situations, I always recommend, if possible, whether it's the privacy attorney, whether it's the forensics firm, right? It's forming and establishing who those parties are and developing some sort of relationship with them ahead of time is going to reduce that chaos, reduce that stress of that situation, of that process. Now, again, I've received phone calls on Saturday afternoons with clients that have had cyber insurance and they're in the middle of a ransomware situation. So happy to obviously support clients in that way, but certainly I shouldn't be the first person to call. So that was an organization that it ended up working out fine because we got them in touch with the right parties at the right time, but that was an organization that didn't quite have as mature of a process as they should have, right? And that time that it took to get to that point, was that material as far as the impact? It's hard to say, but I would say those soft costs, those intangibles of when you're in those chaotic situations, even if the dollar amounts of the impact are minimal, those soft costs, right? As far as the interruption and I guess mental wearing, right, to your staff and your organization, right? That's what you can prevent, or at least try and mitigate with proper planning and testing as well, right? And testing of those processes.
Yeah, no, thank you for that, Jake. I don't see any other questions, but I'll say that that's one of the things that a peer of ours earlier this year that wasn't the SolarWinds, but it was the Kaseya attack that happened on July 2nd, right before the July 4th holiday weekend. He mentioned that he wished he would have had at least some semblance of a plan because it would have helped him execute faster. Like he said that the chaos of it, because he was an IT provider like us, and he got hit as well as all of his customers got hit. And so I remember him saying that, it's like, I was just in this panic of, oh my gosh, what do I do? Like because he hadn't thought through the plan. He didn't have at least a basic roadmap or outline of what to go through and what to follow. And so, he started executing. He had a moment, a while of panic, but then he got into it. But that's definitely something that if you at least try and think through a high level, even a one pager ahead of time, it's better than nothing in those moments. And knowing who is your insurance contact, who is your legal contact, who are the right folks that you want to get on board, your MSP, your managed service provider, outsource IT provider, or internal team, for instance. But anyway, Thank you so much. We went way longer than I anticipated. We've hit the hour mark, so I appreciate everyone who stuck around. Jake, thank you so much for all your expertise and experience sharing that with us today, and hopefully that this has helped prepare all of you in the future for packing your parachute, right? So you know how to get and keep cyber liability insurance as you move into 2022. So thanks for joining us, and until next time, have a great week.
Thanks, Nathan. Thanks, everyone.